So you're probably wondering why we don't have an intro. Well, this is the intro. What's the issue, huh? Now put your butts in a seat and get ready to learn. The idea of the 13th Amendment was to free all slaves within the Union. Section 1 of the amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This means that no one can legally own another person and subject them to work and obey their every command. In other words, no person can be forced to be someone else's property. Section 2 states that Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So I guess we're gonna have to go back in time and explain why this came to be. Slavery began a long time ago, even before America was founded. It was prevalent in the cultures of ancient Egypt, China, Rome, Greece, etc. So basically, slavery was around for a long time, but we don't care about anything else besides America. As you remember from last year's exciting U.S. history class, in 1619, about 20 Africans were brought to the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Most of the Africans were brought to America as slaves, but some of them were indentured servants, which are people under contract to work for another person for a definite period of time, usually without pay, but in exchange for a free passage to a new country. Indentured servants were not slaves. They were given much more leniency than slaves. They served temporarily and could file for early release if they were mistreated by their masters. Another important thing to note is that their children were born free. Slaves, on the other hand, were bound to their masters indefinitely, and if slaves had children, their masters automatically owned their children. But no matter the difference between the two, both slavery and indentured servitude were unjust ways of obtaining inexpensive forms of labor. Over time, more and more Africans were brought to America in greater numbers, and this led to the widespread of slavery across the colonies. Prior to the 13th Amendment, the Constitution did not openly use the words slave or slavery, but it did talk about unfree people, as in the Three-Fifths Compromise. This was a compromise between Southerners who wanted more representation and Northerners who thought the South would get too much power because, representation in the new Congress would be based on population. According to the Fifth Amendment, which states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Since slaves were not considered a whole person and only viewed as property to their masters, they could legally be treated as less than a human. Although abolitionists used the Fifth Amendment to argue against slavery, it became part of the legal basis of Dred Scott versus Sandford, which occurred in 1857, for treating slaves as property. As slavery in the South grew, an abolitionist movement headed by such figures as William Lloyd Garrison grew in strength in the North, calling for the end of slavery nationwide and increasing tensions between the North and South. Proposals to eliminate slavery by constitutional amendment were introduced by Representative Arthur Livermore in 1818 and by John Quincy Adams in 1839, but failed to gain significant traction. As the country continued to expand, the issue of slavery in its new territories became the dominant national issue. The position of the South was that slaves were property and therefore could be moved to other territories like all other forms of property. Multiple compromises were created during this period of expansion. The 1820 Missouri Compromise made Missouri a slave state and Maine a free state, which ultimately balanced the power between the North and South. The Compromise of 1850 made California a free state and banned slave trade in Washington, D.C., passed the Fugitive Slave Law, which was a law that was used to track down runaway slaves and have them returned to their masters, and prevented the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in all new territories from the recently fought Mexican-American War. Despite the compromises, tensions between the North and South continued to rise over the next decade because of the 1852 anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was about a black slave, the fighting between pro-slavery and abolitionist forces in Kansas, the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which struck down provisions of the Compromise of 1850, the abolitionist John Brown's attempt to start a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry, and the 1860 presidential election of Abraham Lincoln, who was a critic of slavery, which later caused the Southern states to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America and beginning the American Civil War. The 13th Amendment was passed at the end of the Civil War, before the Southern states had been restored to the Union. Although the Senate passed it in April 1864, the House did not. At that point, Lincoln took an active role to ensure passage through Congress. He insisted that the passage of the 13th Amendment be added to the Republican Party platform for the upcoming presidential elections. His efforts met with success when the House passed the bill in January 1865 with a vote of 119 to 56. The impact of the abolition of slavery was felt quickly. When the 13th Amendment became operational, the scope of Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation was widened to include the entire nation. Remember that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the South by executive order, so slaves were not legally free in other areas until the 13th Amendment was announced by the Secretary of State on December 18, 1865. Since the slaves were freed and the Three-Fifths Compromise was voided due to the 13th Amendment, the Republicans became worried that the Democratic South would gain political power because the congressional representation would dramatically increase. This made the Republicans very interested in the black votes for some odd reason. The economic situation of most blacks who remained in the South did not change much because basically they were still forced to do labor as punishment for committing a crime. The Southern states created what historian Douglas A. Blackmun called an array of interlocking laws that were intended to criminalize black life. These laws were known as the Black Codes. Blacks were sentenced to harsh labor for using obscene language or selling cotton after sunset because these were now considered criminal acts. Also, under these black codes, blacks were restricted from land ownership and acquiring property, and long periods of child apprenticeship became the norm. Something to keep in mind, some slaves were treated very harshly. They would be raped, starved, whipped, and even spit on. This was not always the case, but those who did experience this treatment were more often than not scarred for life. So you can see why African Americans aggressively fought for their freedom in later years. On paper, the 13th Amendment did its job well in getting rid of slavery and indentured servitude in the Union. However, many people forget the aftermath of the abolishment of slavery. What happened was that once African Americans were freed in the Southern states, specific laws were made that prevented blacks from being equal to whites. These laws, known as the Jim Crow laws, enforced racial segregation even though they gave African Americans a separate but equal status. However, as we all know, blacks were not treated equally because public facilities that were specifically built for blacks were always made inferior to those built for whites. So if I had to change one thing about the 13th Amendment, I would incorporate a section that enforces the full equality of blacks, a section that prevents the formation of any unjust laws specified to blacks or any further unjust treatment to African Americans. This way, blacks would have been able to use the same public facilities as whites and equal transportation rights. There wouldn't have been separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate schools, or separate restaurants or areas within restaurants for eating, just to name a few. If the 13th Amendment had included this change, the Jim Crow laws wouldn't have been created, thus giving blacks their full equal rights. The voting rights of African Americans wouldn't have been suppressed by the white Democrats who gained political power in the Southern states during the 1877 presidential election. And they wouldn't have disappeared from the political life. That being said, maybe the United States' first black president would have been elected to office earlier than the year of 2008. One other thing to think about is that the Jim Crow laws caused many African American males to be arrested for, say, looking at a white person funny. These unnecessary types of arrests caused many black families to be separated and hurt, so this change to the amendment may have kept more black families intact with each other.
That's all, folks.